The Gestapo, the dreaded secret police of the Nazi regime, quickly became synonymous with brutality and torture from its creation in 1933. Its mission was clear: to silence any form of opposition and establish totalitarian control over the population. During World War II, the Gestapo arrested men and women considered enemies of the state, but the women captured faced even greater suffering. They were not only subjected to extreme physical torture, but also to psychological abuse designed to break their spirit. These inhumane methods aimed to strip the female prisoners of their dignity and hope, leaving deep scars that remain in historical memory. What techniques did the Gestapo use to torture female prisoners, and how did some manage to survive these atrocities? Torture in France, the Gestapo and female prisoners. During the Nazi occupation of France, the Gestapo was notorious not only for its physical brutality, but also for its ability to inflict unimaginable psychological torment. Although both men and women fell victim to Nazi repression, women faced even more devastating suffering, as in addition to physical torture techniques, the Gestapo used psychological methods designed to destroy their identity and dignity. In the early years of the occupation, the Gestapo's mass raids in France led to the disappearance of tens of thousands of people. About 40,000 prisoners were sentenced to death through judicial proceedings, but what happened in the Gestapo's torture chambers is beyond human comprehension. The physical torture was brutal. Prisoners, both men and women, suffered broken toes, deep wounds caused by needles inserted under their nails, amputations and lashings with whips made of tendons. The Gestapo also used electric shocks and immersed prisoners in freezing water, a method designed to bring them to the brink of death. However, for women, torture went beyond physical violence. The Gestapo understood that to completely break a prisoner, they had to attack the deepest part of their being, their identity and appearance. Women's faces were disfigured as part of the humiliation process, which not only destroyed their physical integrity, but also stripped them of their sense of self. Their faces were slashed, parts of their ears or the tip of their noses were amputated, their hair was ripped out, or their nails were pulled out. The torture often lasted for days, even weeks, until the prisoner finally gave in. Women's legs were no less targeted by this barbarity. Deep cuts were made and their bones were broken, all with the aim of destroying their will and resistance. This constant physical assault was accompanied by inhumane detention conditions. The cells, designed to hold a maximum of 5 people, often contained up to 20 prisoners. The lack of hygiene, the inability to meet basic needs, and the extreme isolation further worsened the situation. The women, forced to live in constant darkness and overcrowding, were completely isolated from the outside world, without contact with their families and often deprived of sunlight. But physical torture was not the only weapon in the Gestapo's arsenal. Psychological torture was equally devastating. The prisoners, mostly young women, were subjected to relentless interrogations, during which they were constantly threatened with the death of their loved ones. The Gestapo, with its Machiavellian approach, understood that emotional and psychological suffering often surpassed physical pain. Some women were kept in total isolation for weeks, deprived of human contact, while others endured endless interrogations, sometimes interrupted only by the brief moments when their torturers took a break to have tea or coffee. A particularly macabre case involved a well-known Gestapo officer, Musui, who became famous for his cruelty. During interrogations, he would pause to enjoy a drink, even sharing it with his victims, while the prisoners, already on the verge of despair, were forced to wait in a state of extreme tension. When Musui finished his break, the torment would begin anew, with the prisoner unable to anticipate what awaited her. This cycle of endless torture was designed to destroy both the body and the mind of the women. Despite the barbarity, some women managed to survive the hell of the Gestapo, becoming symbols of resistance and bravery. One of the most prominent was Violette Sabo, a French resistance fighter. Sabo was captured by the Gestapo and subjected to horrific tortures, including beatings and burns. During her captivity, her body suffered so much that many who met her after the torture did not recognize her. However, the most impressive aspect was her psychological resistance. Despite the extreme conditions, Violette never gave in to the demands of her torturers. At the time of her execution, she was the only prisoner to face death with bravery, while the other prisoners were shot in the back, unable to face the reality of their fate. Another notable case was that of Eileen Nern, a British intelligence agent who was also captured by the Gestapo. During her interrogation, Nern was repeatedly submerged in cold water, a torture that almost killed her. Despite the physical suffering, she never betrayed her resistance comrades. Her ability to withstand the torture and remain firm in the face of the Gestapo made her a heroine, and her survival is a testament to the courage and determination of women under Nazi occupation. Torture in Norway, the House of Horror. In the Norwegian city of Kristiansand, there was a building known as the House of Horror, a torture center run by the Gestapo. Unlike the Gestapo in other countries such as France, which used physical techniques like chaining or applying electric shocks, the executioners in Norway devised even more perverse methods to break female prisoners. Physical torture, such as mutilating hands and crushing joints, was terrible, but the psychological torture they inflicted had an even more devastating impact. The Norwegian executioners developed psychological torture methods specifically designed to attack the emotional and familial bonds of the victims. In many cases, a woman was forced to witness the suffering of her husband or children. Often the Gestapo would bring in the prisoners' family members and subject them to abuse in front of them, with the aim of dismantling their resistance. Women were forced to watch as their husbands were mutilated or even killed, while others were raped or beaten in front of their children. This type of psychological abuse not only inflicted indescribable pain, but also left emotional scars that endured long after liberation. In addition to physical and psychological torture, women in Norway's House of Horror were subjected to sexual abuse and public humiliation. In many cases, particularly young and attractive prisoners were raped before being sent to the cells. Women who became pregnant in Gestapo prison faced even more brutal treatment. They were beaten, kicked, and humiliated, sometimes even while in labor. This abuse of human dignity was one of the cruelest forms of torture used by the executioners. What happened in Norway during the Nazi occupation had a profound impact on the country's society. Although the death penalty was not common in Norway before World War II, after the country's liberation, the authorities decided to change the penal code and carry out a series of public executions. The executioners responsible for the tortures were arrested, identified, and publicly executed in 1947. This was one of the few cases in modern Norwegian history of mass executions for crimes committed during the Nazi occupation. Throughout Europe, the Gestapo employed a variety of torture techniques, some more extreme than others. In countries like Poland, Yugoslavia, and the Baltic states, the Nazis showed no concern for hiding the brutality of their acts. In the dungeons of Riga, for example, women were stripped and forced to dance for their torturers, while in other regions, methods such as simulated drowning were used, where prisoners were submerged in water until they were almost drowned. In some cases, such as in Poland, women were subjected to cold torture. They were taken to a shower where they initially thought they would receive minimal relief by cleaning off dirt and wounds. However, the shower would continue for hours with no drainage until the prisoners were almost frozen, suffering an unbearable psychological and physical torture. This torture, known as the ice shower, was an effective method to break the resistance of prisoners, who eventually fell into a state of despair and exhaustion. The magnitude of the torture inflicted by the Gestapo in Norway and other occupied countries pushed many prisoners, especially women, into an extreme state of desperation. The inhumane conditions and constant torture caused such profound suffering that many prisoners simply could not endure it, losing their sanity or dying due to physical and mental exhaustion. The abuse not only took their lives, but also stripped them of their identity and dignity as human beings. Torture in Ravensbrook and Yugoslavia. Ravensbrook, a Nazi concentration camp located in northern Germany, was opened in 1939 and specifically designed to imprison and exploit women. During its operation, around 130,000 women and children were prisoners, most of them subjected to inhumane conditions. The camp was notorious for its cruel medical experiments, largely led by SS doctors such as Dr. Karl Gebhardt. Among the most horrific was the intentional infection of wounds with germs, dirt, glass, and other objects to simulate war injuries in order to study the effects of sulfonamide antibiotics. However, these experiments resulted in severe infections, gangrene, and the death of many prisoners. The medical procedures were equally brutal. Amputations and alterations to bones and muscles were performed, leaving many survivors with permanent disabilities. Additionally, the prisoners worked under extreme conditions in quarries, munitions factories, and construction projects, leading to malnutrition, exhaustion, and illness. As the situation worsened, the SS implemented a gas chamber in 1945, where thousands of prisoners, including many women, were murdered, while others died from disease or malnutrition. The Gestapo operated with even greater brutality in countries like Yugoslavia, the Baltic states, and Poland, where their practices were not hidden. In the Riga prisons, for example, women were forced to dance naked as part of their torture. In Poland, one of the most horrible forms of abuse was known as cold torture. The prisoners were taken to a shower where they initially thought they would receive some relief. However, the showers never stopped, and the water became ice cold. Despite their pleas, no one opened the doors, leaving them nearly submerged in freezing water while the sun shone outside. The aim of this torture was to dehumanize them completely, and many prisoners succumbed to diseases due to prolonged exposure to the cold. This was just one of the many cruel tactics used by the Gestapo. They also resorted to sexual assaults and public humiliations. Women were forced to strip in front of guards and were then insulted and beaten as they walked through the hallways. Pregnant women, in particular, were subjected to terrible abuse, beaten and mistreated even while giving birth. One of the most perverse forms of torture inflicted by the Gestapo was the attack on the dignity of young and attractive women. Many were raped before being confined to the cells. In some cases, the prisoners were forced to walk naked through the hallways while officers mocked them and humiliated them with laughter and obscene comments. These women, often pregnant, experienced unimaginable terror and despair, being beaten and kicked even during interrogations. In Czechoslovakia, women captured by the Gestapo were subjected to similar tortures. Most of them were arrested for their involvement in the resistance or as relatives of resistance fighters. As in other places, detention conditions were deplorable, with overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and little access to food and medical care. Women were subjected to brutally physical interrogations, including beatings, kicks, and electric shocks. Sexual assaults were a common form of torture designed not only to inflict physical suffering, but also to humiliate and break the spirit of the prisoners. Absolute pain, the physical and psychological torture of the Gestapo. The women who fell into the hands of the Gestapo were subjected to extremely painful torture methods, both physical and psychological. These tactics aimed to destroy not only their bodies, but also their minds. The victims were bound by their wrists and ankles and, in some cases, suspended or placed on torture tables. These methods, such as the strappado technique, forced the prisoners into extreme positions that caused dislocations and fractures. Cold torture consisted of immersing them in ice-cold water in a warm climate, leaving them in unbearable discomfort that affected their health irreversibly. Electric shocks were applied to sensitive areas, such as the genitals and fingers, causing muscle contractions and severe burns. Another common practice was the extraction of nails and teeth, a torture both physical and psychological, as the prisoners feared further mutilations. Severe beatings with metal rods or falaka, strikes on the soles of the feet, caused extreme pain due to the high concentration of nerves in that area. Burns and scalds inflicted by hot metal objects or boiling water left severe wounds that often became infected in the unsanitary environment of the prisons. Along with physical suffering, the Gestapo implemented psychological tactics that weakened the prisoners' will and left them on the brink of despair. Extreme isolation in dark cells with no human contact or natural light caused disorientation and mental anguish. Additionally, sensory deprivation was a method used to break the mind. Prisoners were subjected to long periods of constant noise, such as loud music or repeated banging, before being left in a chilling silence that confused them even more. The Gestapo psychologically manipulated women with false hopes. They were promised that if they cooperated, they could save themselves or protect their families, but these promises were rarely fulfilled, leaving the prisoners desolate. Undercover agents were also used to gain the trust of the prisoners and make them believe they were sharing information safely, which intensified their feelings of betrayal and despair. Sleep deprivation, coupled with a lack of food and water, further weakened the prisoners. Guards kept the women awake for days, using bright lights and loud noises to prevent them from resting, which increased their anxiety and exhaustion. This physical and mental wear and tear made them more vulnerable to interrogations. The Gestapo also used the tactic of visualizing suffering. Prisoners were forced to watch others being tortured, beaten, or even executed. This caused them deep emotional pain, as they not only saw the suffering of their loved ones, but also felt a profound guilt for being unable to stop it. Witnessing the pain of others was a way to break the morale of the prisoners, making them feel responsible for what was happening around them. Courage in the midst of darkness. During the Nazi occupation, many women were captured by the Gestapo and subjected to indescribable brutalities. However, some of them not only survived, but also resisted with immeasurable courage. Odette Hallowes, the spy who defied the Gestapo. Odette Hallowes was a British intelligence officer working for the Secret Intelligence Service during World War II. Born in London, her fate took her to France, where she joined the French resistance. In 1942, she was sent to France to organize a spy network and help Allied prisoners of war escape. In 1943, Odette was captured by the Gestapo in Lyon. During her arrest, she endured terrible physical torture. Her fingernails and toenails were ripped out, and a hot iron was applied to her back. Despite the horrific wounds and unbearable pain, Odette did not reveal any information about her resistance comrades or the secret operations she was involved in. She was imprisoned in the Fresnes prison, a hell for prisoners of war. Eventually, in 1944, Odette was sentenced to death, but she was miraculously freed when the Allied forces liberated Paris and the Gestapo dissolved. Odette Hallowes became a war hero. After the liberation, she was awarded the Medal of the Order of the British Empire for her bravery. She was one of the first women to receive the title of Commander in the Order of the British Empire. Violette Szabo, the fighter of the French resistance. Violette Szabo was a woman of English descent who joined the French resistance after France fell into Nazi hands. Her life dramatically changed when her husband, a British soldier, was killed in combat. Violette, then a mother of a young child, decided to fight against the German occupation. She joined the Special Operations Executive, SOE, a British secret organization that trained agents to carry out missions in enemy territory. In 1944, after completing her mission in occupied France, Violette was captured by the Gestapo. She was interrogated and subjected to physical torture, including beatings and electrocution, to obtain information about the resistance's activities. The Gestapo tried to break her spirit, but Violette never gave in. Despite her horrible sufferings, she faced her fate with bravery that left a profound impression on her captors. On February 5, 1945, she was executed by a firing squad at Ravensbrook, a concentration camp for women in Germany. Unlike other prisoners who died in fear, Violette looked her executioners in the eyes before falling. In her honor, Queen Elizabeth II awarded her the George Cross, the highest civilian decoration for acts of heroism. Eileen Nairn, the rescue under torture. Eileen Nairn was a British woman who became a spy for the Special Operations Executive, SOE, during World War II. Born in England, her courage led her to France, where she worked actively in the resistance. Her main mission was to help Allied prisoners of war escape and transmit crucial information to the Allies. In 1944, Eileen was captured by the Gestapo while carrying out a mission in which she was transmitting information. She was taken to the Fort de Romainville prison, where she endured terrible physical and psychological torture. The Gestapo tried to extract secrets about the resistance network, but Eileen remained silent during her imprisonment. After weeks of suffering, Eileen was transferred to La Santé, a prison in Paris, where the conditions worsened. She was subjected to brutal beatings and constant threats. Despite this, Eileen managed to survive due to her mental strength and a stroke of luck. A prisoner from the concentration camp managed to bribe the guards to release her. Eileen continued her fight for the resistance until the liberation of France. Irina Sendler, the heroine of Warsaw. Irina Sendler, a Polish social worker, became one of the most heroic figures during the Nazi occupation of Poland. In 1942, she joined the underground group Żegota, which helped save Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto. Irina was responsible for organizing the rescue of over 2,500 Jewish children. whom she smuggled out of the ghetto under extreme conditions and hid in safe homes. In 1943, Irena was captured by the Gestapo. She was brutally tortured, beaten, and subjected to a series of interrogations. Despite the severity of the torture, she never revealed the location of the children or the identities of her resistance colleagues. She was sentenced to death, but in a twist of fate, she was freed after a bribe was arranged by her Zagota comrades. Despite being under Gestapo control, Irena never stopped fighting, and after her release, she continued her rescue activities under a false name. Irena lived to the age of 98, and her bravery was recognized worldwide. She was awarded the title of Righteous Among the Nations by the Israeli government, and her story remains a symbol of resistance and humanity in times of darkness. Simone Lagrange, Resistance in the Shadows. Simone Lagrange, a girl of only 13, was arrested by the Gestapo in 1944 along with her family. Her capture was due to her connection with the French Resistance, a movement fighting against the Nazi regime. Simone and her family were detained in Lyon, a key city for the German occupation. The Gestapo, led by the feared Klaus Barbie, subjected Simone to horrific physical and psychological torture. She was beaten until she lost consciousness, subjected to drowning attempts, and hung by her wrists with spikes. Despite Klaus Barbie's attempts to break her spirit, Simone revealed no information. She even witnessed the execution of her own father by the Nazis. Simone was eventually sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau, the Nazi hell. There she suffered forced labor, hunger, and malnutrition, but remained strong. Despite the extreme conditions, Simone survived until the camp's liberation in 1945. After the war, Simone testified at the trial of Klaus Barbie, playing a crucial role in his conviction for war crimes. Lise Lesevre, a woman facing the terror of Klaus Barbie. Lise Lesevre was an active member of the French resistance fighting against the Nazi occupation in Lyon. She was arrested in 1944 by the Gestapo and brought before Klaus Barbie, who tortured her relentlessly for 9 days. Lisa was severely beaten, hung by her wrists, and subjected to other cruel torture methods. Despite all the pain and suffering, Lisa never betrayed her resistance comrades. She survived the terrible tortures without yielding to the Nazis' demands. Her ability to endure was an example of human strength. After being liberated, Lise joined the efforts to capture and prosecute war criminals, and she became one of the key witnesses against Klaus Barbie in court. Women in the Gestapo, gender traitors. During the Nazi regime, the role of women in the repressive apparatus was more complex than commonly understood. Although images of the Gestapo and concentration camps are mainly associated with men, there were women who actively participated in the torture and persecution of their fellow women. These women, sometimes referred to as gender traitors, were responsible for carrying out violence against other women in the name of the regime. Although the majority of Gestapo torturers were men, some women played a crucial role in repression and physical violence, primarily in the context of concentration camps and prisons. The Aufseherinnen, female guards in the concentration camps, especially in Auschwitz and Ravensbrook, were responsible for maintaining order in the women's prisons. Some of these women actively participated in the torture and execution of female prisoners. The case of Irma Gräser, one of the most well-known figures from this group, is a clear example of how women were part of the Nazi repressive apparatus and involved in the systematic abuse of other women. Gräser, who was a supervisor in Auschwitz, became infamous for her brutality towards the prisoners, many of whom were women. Her involvement in acts of torture, beatings, and murders made her a symbol of female cruelty within the Nazi power structures. However, the involvement of women in the repressive apparatus was not limited to visible figures like Gräser. Other women, many of whom did not gain notoriety, also actively participated in the tortures. Some were responsible for administering physical punishments to the prisoners, guarding them during long punishment marches, or overseeing forced labor. In some cases, these women distinguished themselves through their ruthless efficiency in carrying out the SS orders. The impact of women in the Gestapo was not limited to physical torture. In many cases, women also played a crucial role as informers and collaborators within the Nazi repression machinery. Many of them acted as spies within their communities, denouncing those perceived as opponents of the regime, thus facilitating their arrest by the Gestapo. Gender betrayal was particularly significant, as some women betrayed other women, denouncing them for being Jewish, communist, or simply for their anti-fascist ideas. This type of betrayal was seen as a way of surviving within a regime where collaboration could mean personal protection or advancement within the Nazi hierarchy. Among the women who collaborated with the Gestapo, some infiltrated resistance movements or Jewish communities, serving as spies or informers. These cases of female collaboration with the Nazi repressive apparatus are harder to track than those of men due to the clandestine nature of their activities. However, testimonies document how some women used their gender and apparent passivity to blend in and gain the trust of those fighting against the regime. A clear example of these women was Greta Hermann, who served as an informer for the Gestapo and played a crucial role in identifying members of the resistance. Although Hermann's case is less known than that of Irma Grese, it exemplifies how women were not only complicit in the violence, but also helped perpetuate the system of repression through their active collaboration. After the fall of the Nazi regime, many of the women who participated in the torture and repression faced trials and sentences. However, the treatment of these women was, in many cases, less severe than that of their male counterparts. Irma Grese, for example, was sentenced to death in 1945 and executed the same year, but many other women who collaborated with the Gestapo or the concentration camps received lesser sentences or were released without charges. The fact that women were judged differently reflected the complex nature of their involvement in the Nazi regime and how post-war society viewed them. Although not all female collaborators were punished justly, the testimonies of survivors from the Gestapo and the concentration camps show the pain and suffering caused by the gender traitors. The women who worked in the repressive apparatus were not only responsible for physical violence, but also betrayed the trust of their own comrades, an act of treason that had profound repercussions for both the victims and the legacy of the war. Women were the most affected by the brutal tactics of the Gestapo, facing not only extreme physical torture, but also psychological abuse designed to dismantle their identity and dignity. Mutilation, sexual abuse, and extreme isolation not only inflicted indescribable pain, but also left deep scars on their spirits and collective memory. Despite this inhuman suffering, many women showed extraordinary resilience and bravery, becoming symbols of hope and defiance. This reality underscores the importance of remembering and honoring their sacrifice, ensuring that such atrocities are never repeated, and highlighting the indomitable value of the human spirit in the face of totalitarian oppression.